Well, Jimmy, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. I'm going to do a little bit quick bio so everybody knows who you are. You told me you've been in the space since 2013. You are a Bitcoin developer and you're currently working for IPBIT. If people don't know what IPBIT is, what is IPBIT?
Well, IPBIT is an exchange, and they do large sizes with like an OTC trading desk and stuff. It's one of the larger exchanges in the United States. They're based in New York. I'm personally in Austin, but I work for them. But yeah, there's also another branch of the company called Paxos. That's the part that I'm more involved in. But yeah, we're selling blockchain solutions to businesses.
Cool, awesome. Well, the reason I got you on the show is I've been following your articles for a while, and they're fantastic, by the way. Thank you so much for writing them.
Thank you.
Especially the last one, which we'll get to later on in the show. But for people who aren't privy to what's going to happen and happening currently, can you kind of give us a recap of what's been currently going on in the Bitcoin ecosystem?
Sure. So for about the last 3 years, I'd say since about 2014, scaling has been sort of at the forefront of the Bitcoin sort of community debate, if you will. Scaling in the sense that there's two sort of different ways to scale. There's sort of increasing the block size, which would require a hard fork. I'll explain that in a minute. And something called SegWit that would be done via soft fork. And those are two sort of different ways to increase transaction capacity. Right now, in Bitcoin, if you did more than like 3 or 4 transactions per second, you would completely clog the network. The mempool would grow very quickly, and the network just isn't designed to handle that much. Increasing block size will, proportionately make that bigger. SegWit is sort of another way to scale, but it also fixes a lot of other technical problems. But basically, it's there are two different ways, and SegWit is a soft fork. Larger blocks is a hard fork, and the difference between the two gets a little bit technical, but suffice it to say that soft fork is generally seen as being a little bit safer than a hard fork, and that's sort of the big debate here. But a hard fork can be a little bit easier to sort of test, I guess, because it's less change in code, basically.
So you mentioned two things: a soft fork and a hard fork. So what's the big problem right now that everyone's talking about that's approaching within August?
Okay, yeah. So this thing has been going on for a few years, like I said, and there's been sort of no resolution. And there's something called BIP 141, which is an implementation of SegWit that started signaling November of last year. And what's been happening is the BIP 141 uses a trigger mechanism which requires 95% of the miners to signal that they're ready for BIP 148. Unfortunately, a lot of miners don't like the idea of SegWit. They prefer sort of a hard fork to a bigger block. So they've not been signaling that they're ready for SegWit, which obviously has a lot of the developers mad because they put a lot of time and effort into SegWit. So what's happened is there's sort of like a user movement that's been sort of spearheaded by a bunch of people that are for SegWit, and that's called UASF, which stands for User Activated Soft Fork, and it's based on another BIP. BIP, by the way, stands for Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, and that's how you're supposed to get in new features into Bitcoin is by making Bitcoin improvement proposals. So SegWit is BIP 141. This user-activated soft fork is BIP 148. Anyway, BIP 148 basically is telling miners, hey, if you don't signal for SegWit, then we're going to reject your block. And what that does is it splits the network into two. You're going to have two coins, essentially. You have sort of the miner coin, which they can mine non-SegWit signaling blocks. And you have the user fork, where you're forced to signal for SegWit. And the idea behind that is that because there's a 95% threshold, if you force every block to have SegWit signaling, then you're going to have 100% of your blocks signaling for SegWit. So that will the idea is that will trigger SegWit. And they've decided that it's going to be a flag day activation, which means that on August 1st, the code's already sort of out there. So if you're running the same software as the people that created the UASF BIP 148 client, then you will reject any blocks that are not signaling for SegWit. So you will only accept blocks that signal SegWit, and that's going to cause sort of a fork. And obviously Bitmain made a response last night or so. So yeah.
Well, you had an article, I think 2 articles before, you were talking about game theory. So what are some possible outcomes, or statistically in your mind, what do you think are more probable to happen?
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer as far as the probability, but here's some things that can happen. So if it forks, right, on August 1st, some miners decide not to signal for SegWit and build on that chain. Other miners decide to signal SegWit and go on the user chain. What can happen, what's sort of expected to happen, because the miners control so much hash rate, is that the miner fork will grow much longer, faster. But what happens, because this is a soft fork, the user fork, once it gets longer than the miner chain, it will just sort of wipe out the miner chain. Once it's longer, the miners have to accept the user fork because it's longer. That's sort of the rules of the client that they're running. So that's sort of one possibility, and that's sort of the I would say like the second most hoped for possibility among UASF advocates, is that their chain would slowly grow, gain more hash rate, and eventually overtake the other fork and wipe it out. The best scenario for them is obviously if all the miners just decide to signal for SegWit, in which case they would just stay on that one chain. They would get SegWit and everything would be okay, which sounds like it might happen. There's something that happened today with SegWit 2x. Some other possibilities include the miners sort of hard forking so that they don't have this wipeout risk, which would be very bad for them in the sense that like all the transactions that were in those blocks would suddenly be nullified and they could get double spent against. So that's kind of a big deal because if I send you 500 Bitcoins on the miner chain and then it gets wiped out, I have the 500 back, which is a terrible thing, right? Like that transaction may or may not be valid. I could just send it to another in one of my addresses, and you never get the 500 Bitcoin.
Might be, sorry to interject, though. Some people might be getting confused. What's the main principality behind the two ideology or thoughts? Is it, will SegWit increase lower profits for the miners? Like, what's the main reasons for these two camps arguing from point A to point B?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're not entirely sure. And that's because in a sense, SegWit kind of gets more throughput and larger blocks and things like that. But bigger blocks, it's kind of become. I put out this hypothesis in the article before last, which is that both parties kind of want more control over Bitcoin. Bitcoin is getting really valuable. It's like. It's $40-something billion. That's a lot of money, and it's only growing. So, if you have more influence over the direction of Bitcoin, that's going to make more of a difference. So, my theory is that it's really more about control and not necessarily the technical argument, because I don't think either side's that into it. I mean, like people talk like it is, but like you talk to the core developers, like I have. And a lot of them are like, we would like it, but status quo is fine. It's okay. And there's a lot of people with that sort of attitude. So I mean, you've asked sort of the question that everyone's been asking, which is why are they fighting, right? Like this is like everyone can win if this thing is resolved. And but yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a good answer, unfortunately.
So there's a couple of some key dates, right? I think one of them is in July for everyone that can start signaling early. Like what are the key dates that are happening?
Yeah, so you can signal for UASF BIP 148 right now. I think Slush Pool has a mining option where you can just sort of signal for BIP 148. I believe it's right now around 0.25% of the network, and at that rate, that's like 2 or 3 days per block, which is not very quick. That's extremely slow. So yeah, imagine like people complain about waiting 30 minutes for a block. Imagine waiting 3 days, right? Like that's like worse than like the normal financial system. So yeah, the main date is August 1st, but there's other dates, especially with regard to SegWit 2x, which is sort of like a compromise that Barry Silbert came up with a bunch of industry leaders. SegWit 2X has sort of like release dates like from now.
So just to clarify, you got SegWit and SegWit 2X. So SegWit 2X is 2 megabyte blocks.
Right. It's sort of an like a compromise of both. It's saying SegWit plus 2 blocks, and that has sort of a release schedule in July. They're trying as hard as they can, as far as I can tell, to get it out before August 1st, because that's sort of like a drop dead date at this point, because the network will fork if there's enough mining power on the user side, which I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but that certainly seems like a possibility. So yeah, that's a major date. Yeah, there are other dates. I think October 15th is a date that not a lot of people know about, and that's Bitcoin Unlimited sort of forking date. And Bitcoin Unlimited is sort of they're with the miners, right? They're 4 bigger blocks, and they're even if you avoid August 1st, even if you somehow get them to stand down, you have October 15th, which says, hey, we're going to release big blocks as a hard fork, and a bunch of miners may go that way. So that might be another fork in the road. There's multiple dates here that have some danger around it.
Now, okay, for SegWit can be kind of like a precursor for the future for the Lightning Network. If we're future proofing ourselves and looking into the future, do any of these protocols in the next couple of years eliminate the actual usage of ASICs?
Not as far as I can tell. I mean, you would have to change the proof of work function, and that would be a major hard fork. And I've actually argued that if the UASF BIP 148 doesn't have that much hashing power, and if they get attacked, it's entirely possible that they change their proof of work function, in which case ASICs wouldn't work on their branch. And you would have to use CPUs or GPUs or something like that. But of course, like that reduces security enormously, because you don't have the hashing power that the miners have, and a state actor, for example, can attack this chain. But yeah, that's definitely a possibility. It's very hard to get rid of ASICs in total, just because pretty much any algorithm or process that you can think of, you can sort of design into a circuit, and it just takes time. That's the only thing. And ASIC design is very expensive. I wrote another article a while ago. It's anywhere from like $10 to $20 million to just get to the point where you can produce it. Then you have to pay a chip fab to go and make the chips for you, and that's a lot. It's a very huge capital cost, and it takes a lot of money to get going. And this is why Bitmain has such a strong position in the mining game, is because they figured out the entire supply chain, all the design, all the testing.
They own the vertical.
Yeah, they do. There are competitors, Bitfury and Canaan IO being 2 of them, but you look at the prices and the hashing power, and it does look like Bitmain has an advantage there, which is why a lot of miners buy their equipment from them, and they seem sort of inextricably linked in an economic fashion to them.
Well, that's a good segue into 2 things. A, Bitmain's article that they release, and I want to talk about your response to it.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, my response is really more just sort of like an examination of what the hell they're saying, because I mean, I don't know if you could tell, but their press release is clearly written by a non-English speaker, and it's sometimes hard to parse it. And honestly, a lot of this conflict, I think you asked this question earlier about why are they fighting? A lot of it, I think, is honestly a little bit cultural, right? Like a lot of the miners are in China, and they do all the manufacturing and stuff. They don't contribute that much to development. A lot of the developers and the core contributors, and even the people on Twitter and things, they're mostly in the Western Hemisphere, right? Like US and Europe. So there's definitely sort of like a culture clash, and there was a Hong Kong agreement that was there like 2 or 3 years ago that sort of broke apart, and I think from sort of like an East Asian point of view, that's sort of like very dishonorable, and they have a hard time trusting sort of people that broke an agreement, and that's been a major sort of theme throughout this whole conflict. But anyway, they made this press release in part as a way to respond to sort of the August 1st UASF date. And I argued before in the scenarios article that if UASF has any sort of traction, then it's going to be in the interest of the miners to do some sort of hard fork to prevent the wipeout protection that I was talking about. There's also something else called replay protection, which is endemic to both chains, which is that if I send you 500 Bitcoins from one chain, the miner chain, some third party may be able to replay that and also give you the 500 coins on the user chain. And that may not matter that much between you and me. If I'm paying you like some amount, you can like pay me back or give me a refund or something. But from an exchange's point of view, that could be problematic because if I withdraw some money from the exchange, say the miner coin, and it's 500 miner coin that I need to receive, and they give it to me, but I replay that transaction and also get 500 user coin, then the exchange is out a lot of money. And this is exactly what happened with Ethereum. When Ethereum split to Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, Coinbase lost a bunch of money because they were sending out Ethereum, but also, and people were replaying them and getting also Ethereum Classic, which they had to make, they had to just sort of take that loss. And that can be kind of a big problem. And so, what Bitmain's press release essentially says is if UASF BIP 148, if the user chain becomes popular, what we're going to do is we're going to add replay protection, we're going to add wipeout protection, and we're going to release that like 3 days later. I think that's just to make sure that their software runs well and that the user fork is sufficiently popular for them to be forced to do it. But that's essentially the idea. They're going to make it a permanent fork, and at that point, there's no going back. It's always going to be two coins from then on. Mm-hmm. And I put a cartoon of sort of like Kennedy and Khrushchev at the Cuban Missile Crisis there, because that's kind of what this is. It's total brinksmanship. It's sort of like bringing everybody to the edge and saying, okay, we're threatening this, we're gonna have 2 Bitcoins. That's going to be terrible for the price. And it would be, because you're like, I don't know about your listeners, but at least for me, Bitcoin is largely a store of value. And one of the biggest properties that you need to know about store of value is that it's not going to change, right? Mm. Like, this is why gold's been so valuable over the years, is because it doesn't change, right? Gold is always gold, and it doesn't rust, it doesn't tarnish, it doesn't, and and in that way, Bitcoin is great. But if you break it and make it into 2 different coins, now you've sort of broken immutability, and that can be devastating for the price.
They'll self-sabotage themselves if they do that.
Yeah, I mean, you would think so. I mean, but this is brinksmanship, right? Like, both sides want more control, and both sides want something to happen. And I mean, think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? It was about like putting a nuke on Cuba. Really, it wasn't worth having a world war over, right? And it's kind of the same here. We're talking about scaling, which is really more of a medium of exchange function, right? Like, just sort of trading. Mm-hmm. And if you're using it as a store of value, you don't really care that much about it. Like, like you don't buy houses to go trade them, right? Like, you keep it to live in and to like appreciate in price. That's how I think most Bitcoiners are using it. So I don't think this is necessarily that big a deal to most people, but we're sort of at this point where there are 2 factions that are sort of threatening each other, and that's kind of where we are.
So what's your advice then for approaching August 1st and this whole like August to October agenda for people? I know you mentioned before that on August 1st, for maybe a couple of days, maybe even a week, that the whole network's going to be bogged down. So do you recommend people just taking their coins off or wherever and just keeping them on like a private wallet?
Yeah, I think it's very important to sort of control your own keys in the first place, right? You shouldn't keep money on exchanges. If you
totally agree on that, 100% on that one.
Yeah, if you've been in Bitcoin for a while, like I have, you've seen a lot of exchanges fail, a lot of exchanges get robbed, and you should just keep it off on it in any case. But if you do have some money on exchanges, unless you're willing to lose it, I would get it off before August 1st, because there's so many ways in which an exchange can screw this up. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that they have completely competent people, but you just never know, right? Like, you screw up something, there's a replay attack on the other chain, and you might be out a bunch of money, or the exchange might be out a bunch of money, and they might socialize the losses among all their users or something like that. There's so many ways in which you as a user can get screwed. So get it off the exchange, sort of keep it, and be very, very careful about transacting after August 1st. In fact, I personally am not planning to do any transactions after August 1st for at least like a week until like the situation resolves. And there are many ways it can resolve, but as long as the two chains are on the same proof of work function, right? If they're both using SHA-256, then it's very, very dangerous. And that's because if one side has much more hash power than the other, say one has 5% and the other 95, the 95 can attack the 5 with like 7% of the hash power, and they can cause that chain to wipe out. In which case, your transaction might just be invalidated. Or any payments that you receive might be double spent or something like that. So you have to be extremely careful about what it is that where it is that you're sending money. I just wouldn't transact at all, because there's just so much risk on either side. And if you keep it as a store value, just don't touch it, right? And you'll be okay. As long as you control your own private keys, you'll be okay.
So do you predict any major price fluctuation besides what we see in the correction right now market today, or do you think it's already kind of built into it currently?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, because I don't know how Bitcoin doesn't trade on necessarily like fundamentals of certain things,
Sure.
right? It's sort of like decoupled from any sort of economic indicator. I mean, there may be some things, but it's not really correlated to anything. So it's hard to know when something's priced in. I will say though that it's possible. Like this was an argument made to me by Tone Bays, a good friend of mine. The price may go up a lot right before August 1st, and the reason he's saying is, well, if you have any brain cells at all, you're going to take off the money off the exchanges, but that's going to reduce the supply of coins on the exchanges, which will.
Oh, that's a good point.
That may cause a price rise. I could also see it as sort of like a price decline, as people say, you know what, I don't want to deal with Bitcoin. I'll just buy back in when everything's over. So that's the other sort of possibility as well. So it's hard to tell. I don't pretend to know how the market works, and I divested at least a little bit just in case something crazy happens. So that may or may not be something you want to do. But then again, it might go up like crazy. So it's one of these like weird situations. Yeah, that's the other thing too. There is a possibility of sort of like like standing down or something like that, right? Like everyone's sort of getting coming off the edge and not deciding to fight or whatever. And that would be very good news for Bitcoin, obviously, and that could possibly cause a huge price rise. So there's a lot of things to consider, and I think I would be more comfortable making predictions like closer to the August 1st date, especially since SegWit 2x is sort of like a dark horse there.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
So SegWit 2x was an agreement that Barry Silbert sort of coordinated right before Consensus 2017, which was a couple of weeks ago. And basically, he brought a lot of industry leaders together and said, okay, can I get you to agree to something? And he got something like 80% of all hashing power in the world, all these exchanges, all these wallets to sign an agreement. And the agreement basically says, we're going to activate SegWit, and we're going to go to 2 megabyte blocks, and we're going to release the code to do it. And that was lauded by people. A lot of developers didn't like it because they weren't consulted, and it seems like a little bit hurried and stuff like that. But who knows? That it's possible that may come through and people will run it and it won't have bugs and everything will be fine. And in which case, the thing about the UASF BIP 148 is that if SegWit is locked in or activated before August 1st, then it won't do anything. Like it doesn't matter. So like that's sort of like a way to defuse that particular bomb is by activating SegWit beforehand, and SegWit 2x may do that, which may be a good sign. And they just recently did like a pull request, I think today, where it would be compatible with the current signaling. So it'd be much easier for a miner to sort of just switch on something rather than run all their software, and it would be okay.
Cool. So I'm gonna summarize this for everybody. There's
Okay.
there's a lot of different, based on your game theory article, which I'll make sure I leave a link below this video afterwards. To summarize, there's the probabilities of different scenarios are high, so they can go many different ways.
Yeah.
Price can go up, price can go down depending on what happens. There's different protocols. You have BIP 148, you have SegWit, 2 megabyte blocks. You have key dates, as we mentioned. You can signal now. August 1st is no matter what, there's going to be a new implementation. Then you mentioned August 15th for the Bitcoin Unlimited. And then you did touch base on the fact that to keep your coin safe or Bitcoin safe, control your private keys. If it's on the exchange, take that off. Put it on a hard wallet, paper wallet, but own the keys yourself. And just sit back and relax, and hopefully people don't go crazy on this. Would you say that's a good summary?
I'd say so. Yeah, I mean, there's been bigger crises in Bitcoin before, and we've lived through. If you've been in crypto for a while, man, there's been a lot of ups and downs. We just had a 3-year bear market. We've like more than doubled the price since the beginning of the year, which is fantastic. And that's something that you shouldn't forget, right? Like there's times when it goes up like crazy. There's times when it goes down. There's a lot of volatility. Volatility tends to follow a big price rise, as we've seen in this space. So, I mean, don't be surprised, but if you treat it as a store of value, just lock it away and don't worry about it, right? Like that works for a lot of people. That certainly worked for pretty much everybody since the beginning.
That's my investment strategy. It's like Warren Buffett, and just set it and forget it.
Just set it and forget it, and that may be a very good strategy here.
Cool. Well, Jimmy, I want to thank you so much for coming on and educating everybody out there. If people want to find more information about you, what is the best resource?
Let's see. I have a Twitter, Medium, and GitHub account, all with the same name, Jimmy Song.
Cool. I'll make sure I put that below the video. Jimmy, thank you so much.
Thank you.